So you've polished your masterpiece, and you're ready to let it out into the cold and scary world. Then your readers fall in love with the villain. Knowing audience psychology informs your writing and your world building by making sure your audience is on the same page as you. Pun intended. I'm author DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, let's get you guys a Christmas present. Subscribe to my newsletter and get a copy of Cora Blake Arcane Agent for free. This short story is the prequel to the Dragon's Dream saga and a great chance to get started with the series. I linked the newsletter sign up in the comments, so make sure to sign up and get your free copy. A common misconception, or even a conceit among storytellers, is you're telling the tale that you want to tell with your genius, and if your audience doesn't get what you were going for, that's on them. Well, it's cool if you're an abstract artist and you have a small cadre of millionaires lining up to auction over your work. It's a lot more difficult in writing to make money because you need to appeal to the masses. With that said, if you and your friends want to have vacuum cleaners in your Dungeons and Dragons campaign and play a story wrapped around your characters murdering everyone in sight for loot, awesome. Have fun with that. If you want to write a story of your undying love for toast, speak your truth, buddy. But it's only when you're seeking a mass audience that we need to start caring about what they think, what they like, and how they like it. Some writers refer to this concept as writing to market, but I avoid that term because it paints with a very narrow brush. Writing to market basically means that you look at everything that is currently popular in the genre you want to write in, and then, well, do that. It's fine, to each their own. I'm just not a person who can commit to doing something like that. So, what we're talking about today are often mistakes that we make in our writing, and other pitfalls and perils that can lead to a disconnect with our audience. We'll also be talking about some tips and tricks to understand how to play into or play with audiences. So, let's get into it. So, first, we're going to talk about managing expectations and then subverting them. The expectation that an audience places on you as a storyteller, without reading a word you've written, is that you'll walk them through this narrative landscape that you made and will keep your promises. That's it. The rest is up to you. Now, those two elements are so broad and so open that there can be a lot of missteps we make if we forget them. The things we bring to the table after they start reading, our plot, our conceits, our world building, this is all stuff you can file under the broader spectrum of suspension of disbelief stuff. Because our audience needs to accept our world the way we made it, they need to accept that our storyline makes sense, and so on. Obviously, magic returning to 2082 Earth, for example, is really close to the world we know, so believability expectations are pretty high, while a world populated by rocket raccoons doing Jedi stuff in deep space is really far out there, and we need to explain a whole lot more to make that believable and compelling. That second word I used there is super important. Compelling stories make our audiences want to keep reading. What are some tips for that? Well, I'm glad you asked, because studying this stuff is hard and screwing it up is easy. So, as a general rule, here are some tried and true tips for compelling stories. First of all, remember rising and falling action. Whether a drama or a military action adventure, remember that audience attention span and excitement response moves in waves. Your writing should have built-in cool-down periods to wash the audience's palate clean, otherwise we're constantly trying to outdo or top what we did last. We're going to get into that later. The chapter sequel structure is the second one, and if you'll remember in the past, I've often warned against cliffhanger endings to your tales. As a general rule, never ever do it. However, that does not apply to chapters. In fact, I encourage it. Nothing screams page turner like a wild double cross or a stunning revelation to close out a chapter. The way we can approach this is the chapter sequel structure, whereby we have mini rising and falling actions. For example, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down. End of chapter. In the next chapter, Jill is reacting to this event. She goes tumbling after him. She finds he's broke his crown and he dies in her arms. This, of course, is part of an overarching story of how Jill became a demon hunter. The story we're telling in this first chapter, and then the second one that comes along creates this what will happen next pacing, which is the sweet, creamy nougat that keeps our audiences coming back. The third one is creating investment. Your characters have to be compelling too. Don't forget to take advantage of these cooldown periods between the action to develop your characters. The audience needs to feel something. In the world of professional wrestling, the term getting a pop means audiences cheer. Getting heat means boos and negative chants. Both of these are good. The only thing wrestlers don't ever want are boring chants, or worse, the sound of crickets. Evoke a reaction, whether they love your character or love to hate them. Any strong emotion is a good feeling. Now, let's discuss the opposite side of this coin. Subverting expectations is, in a nutshell, that your audience thinks they know what the formula is you're working off of, and then you change it on them in a pleasantly surprising way. We're going to revisit the pleasantly surprising part in a moment, but let's establish first what this means. A plot twist, for example, can be part of subverting expectations, but it isn't the subversion itself, so don't mistake one for the other. Here, let's look at an example. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown because Jill pushed him and wanted to watch a man die. See, you think you know where we're going, and then blam, we went from fairy tale to dark serial killer in the making of Jill. Okay, I'm in. What's next? So if you're going to break formula like this and subvert a genre's tropes or audience expectations, it's all about follow-through. When the shock factor wears off, we have to like what the end product is. And this is going back to a point I've told you guys 100 times. Keep your promises. Remember Chekhov's gun. A gun on the mantle in Chapter 1 goes off in Chapter 3. There's a reason for those numbers too. Let's talk about that. I mentioned earlier, human attention span moves in waves. Understanding this all but dictates your pacing. How? Look at drama versus action, or in this case, the movie Heat versus Die Hard. They're both crime films of a sort, but their comparisons pretty much end there. Heat is a slow and plotting drama, while Die Hard is non-stop action. Now, what I just said is also a lie, and we're going to look at how. Heat uses a pacing that gives the appearance of slow and plotting, spending time developing an aging Robert De Niro that's been in the game too long and his loyal crew. We also get into Al Pacino's character as the cop that's after him. The early beats of the film establish these characters through heavy character development of their personal lives, their code, and how they interact with others. But this is super important. It's also filled with these mini-adventures, such as De Niro setting up a money laundering for his stolen bonds, but then gets double-crossed. Or the tension that we get when De Niro and Pacino are together in a moment of mutual respect on the eve of them going after each other. There are a lot of nail-biting, tense moments of rising action, and they're spaced out between these absolutely huge blocks of character development. Die Hard is not non-stop action. It has huge set pieces with very brief cooldowns. The mini-adventures, whether it be the escape through the air duct or the shoot the glass moment, they cool us off afterward with switches to the unfolding scene outside or conversations between John and Sergeant Powell. It's all designed to build character or build upon the overall crisis and set up the next action scene. The reason one feels slow and plotting and the other feels like non-stop action is because with Die Hard, the space between the action scenes is much shorter. Heat is almost double the runtime of Die Hard and has far fewer action scenes, though the most iconic one that's in there is 10 minutes long and it's glorious. The way these two different writers take advantage of the wave of attention and stimuli is that Die Hard constantly needs to top itself. Each scene is bigger than the last. Each time the stakes are higher. That's because the short time between these scenes doesn't allow the brain to come down from the action high. We let it cool down just a little bit and then we go bigger. With Heat, all of our action is grounded. No one is jumping off buildings using a fire hose as a rope, so the long spaces between their using character development makes us more invested in the stories of who these people are, whereas Die Hard doesn't try to get too deep into that. John McClane's motivations can be simplified to save his wife and survive the terrorists. Heat is so much more than that, with the relationship of Al Pacino and his unfaithful wife, his troubled daughter, and so on. We're told to care more about the characters than the action. Die Hard is the reverse. We love John McClane because he survives and perseveres these action scenes and makes it through the crisis. Let's see an example of this in action in sci-fi. For this, we're going to reach out to a textbook example of these short breaks requiring you top yourself. So we're going to look at an array of scenes from Star Trek Generations. Now, there are two storylines going on at the same time at this point in the film, but we're going to ignore one of them entirely. So, in Chapter 1, the evil Klingons Lursa and Betor have figured out the shield frequency of the Enterprise and tune their weapons to match it. They begin firing at will, tearing the Enterprise apart. In Chapter 2, the crew determines a way to fight back and destroys the Klingon ship with a daring move. In the new Chapter 1 that follows, the damage sustained will cause a warp core breach. The Enterprise must be evacuated. Tensions mount as every member of the crew must flee to the upper saucer section of the ship. In Chapter 2, the star drive section of the ship explodes. The resulting shockwave throws the saucer section into the atmosphere of a planet. Bracing for the worst, the saucer section is ripped apart as it crashes down on the planet. Now, here you can see the chapter and sequel structure in action. The very brief period of respite after the Klingon ship is destroyed sets up another bigger set piece than the last. For all of my critiques in this film, and there are many, this is one thing the film does by the book and should be closely examined for its rising action. Study the scene and learn from it. So, here's what we're getting at storytelling-wise. In these waves of human attention, high action doesn't lead to coherent thought. People get swept up by emotion in these high points of stimuli, which leads to those, wait, did he just grab a knife? Moments in action scenes. It's happening so fast the audience can't slow down to process details well. In these lulls, the low points of the wave, we want to fill in information, such as character development, when the brain can process it. How much space or recovery time you give to the audience dictates how action-packed it feels, but also requires your action scenes to deliver to expectation. High action is always topping itself, where drama can have more grounded, contained action that isn't competing with every scene that came before it. There's one other aspect to riding this wave, and it's a pitfall so dangerous, we need to discuss it separately. Would you believe this whole episode came from some stupid radio ad? Yeah, I'm not kidding. Radio is the spoken word, closer in form to books than movies because it asks the audience to visualize rather than showing you what it means. As such, radio ads are often subject to the same rules and critiques that apply to creative writing, as opposed to lessons we've learned from film. So, this is the gist of the radio ad script I was talking about. A guy comes home to tell his wife about the great new deal he got on a family plan for phones, and while he's talking about it, slips in that he wrecked their car. Now, as you're looking at the script here, hit the pause button and read it over. I'll give you a second. See if you can spot the problem. If you said that it's not selling the product, you're absolutely right. What's taking place here is something that can also endanger your writing. See, the car accident issue becomes an eclipse. The way this is written, our brains find an interesting story, and we latch onto the details of that. The result of this attention switch is that the lines in between, where they're selling their product, becomes background noise that our brains filter out while we wait for the more compelling story to advance. Radio ads do this all the time, coming up with these kooky characters and trying to paint a visual so hard that you can't remember what the product was they were selling. Now that I've pointed that out, you're probably never going to stop noticing it, so you're welcome for that. How do we move this to an example in the fantasy writing world? Well, as far as consciousness goes, people sure do love them some Mandalorian. What's everyone talking about? It's great plot, it's cool character, the fascinating world building. No. Baby Yoda. That's not to say it doesn't have any of the other stuff, but Baby Yoda has become so meme-riddled it ran into pop culture before you could say, hey, no spoilers. Now, it's an awesome show and everything, but you have to be careful. Whether it be through dialogue, action scenes, or a side character, nothing can ever be cooler, more interesting, or more compelling than your plot. I mean, just imagine an episode of Star Trek where some charismatic, badass adventure dude comes in and he's like the Indiana Jones of the 24th century, and he takes Data on this archaeological adventure with him, and there's this sprawling action story through an ancient alien world. But that's the subplot of the episode. We're really trying to focus on Riker and Deanna reconciling their relationship, a drama. Not only would this subplot derail the whole episode, but even worse, if the character was cool enough, you could potentially have the audience be like, I'd rather be watching a show seeing what that guy is doing. So the point is, guard yourself. If you have the coolest idea in mind for a supporting character or a villain, stack them up against your plot and your protagonist. Don't let them be bigger, cooler, or faster. But DC, surely there are exceptions. Well, guy who talks to your monitor, there are, but I dare say they're once-in-a-lifetime risks. Game of Thrones in its first season was compelling, interesting, with an amazing plot and a fascinating main character. When the axe falls at the season finale, you realize there isn't a main character. Worse, after the shock of the Red Wedding in Season 2 wears off and there's no Robb Stark, I was genuinely left with the question, where do we go from here? I wondered how the series could continue if all these deaths were being used for shock value, or who could fill the void and rise up. And not sticking the landing aside, Game of Thrones actually delivered consistently good story throughout. There were low points, sure, but the amount of risk taken, that the larger world and the plot was more important than any central character, cannot be understated. This kind of idea could have died in the incubation chamber if it wasn't done so well. So I'd say yes, there is an exception, but boy is the difficulty high. Understanding audience psychology means we're always looking through the lens of a reader. As a writer, we want to steer and direct them towards what we want them to see, and every now and again we can even play with their minds by punishing them for listening to us. At the end of the day, though, we serve them as our master, and it's important to give the baby their bottle. So, do you want an early Christmas present? Yeah, you do. Sign up for my newsletter. The link is in the comments below, and you're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. The master of Kung Fu and friendship wants all his friends to have the best toys. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.